You think a security badge is a door key. Mine was a fuse. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I want to know which skyline is listening. My name is Dr. Aerys Thorne. For 15 years, I held the quiet, unglamorous title of Chief Security Architect at Vanguard Systems. We were the kind of company that preferred to be invisible. We built systems that people never spoke about in public, but relied on in private. Data vaults for research labs, infrastructure for federal teams, redundancy you only noticed when it worked, because when it worked, nothing happened. That invisibility is our craft. That silence is part of the design. The facility where I kept most of my life was an underground complex that smelled faintly of ozone and coffee at 4 a.m., the smell of machines and humans doing holy work. The server rooms hummed like restrained engines. The air itself was a map of discipline. My lanyard had a titanium token on it the size of a coin, an object I handled every morning at the mirror before the commute. Check the stitching, feel the weight, close my hand around it as if to pin my day to certainty. Small rituals anchor you. They are how fragile bureaucracies sustain themselves across years. Vanguard had been my work and my argument to the world for a long time. 15 consecutive federal audits, each one a kind of liturgy, checklists fulfilled, chains of custody documented, signatures lined up like beatings of a metronome. We had survived funding cycles, acquisition rumors, 2 CEO shakeups, and a pandemic that recalibrated the world. That longevity was not luck. It was the sum of processes that no one outside the operations room needed to understand. People called it reliability. I called it respect for consequence. Then Kieran Ashford walked in wearing a shirt you could have sold as a concept piece. He was young, too young for the title he wore, VP of Digital Innovation. He had a smile calibrated to headline photos and a haircut that caught light like a set piece. He arrived in a wave of brand messaging and a consulting agency's deck of slides so polished they felt like lacquer. He smelled faintly of cologne and confidence. His father, Lawrence, had been the founder and CEO in the way only founders who still held the chair can be, protective, indulgent, deaf to nuance. Lawrence liked the idea of innovation more than the process that extracts it without burning the company in the attempt. He loved headlines. Kieran's first 30 days were a montage of swagger. He replaced framed audit commendations with abstract art that used more colors than our compliance matrices did. He modernized the message. We move faster, he said. We cut bureaucracy. He spoke in verbs: accelerate, disrupt, liberate, while our engineers read his slides like tarot and felt something in their chests that resembled dread. It's easy to pitch speed to a board that remembers quarterly targets more vividly than legacy. It's lethal when someone who lives in press conferences is handed the keys to systems designed for patience. Project Velocity arrived as a town hall under a banner that read, "Liberate the Stack." Kieran filled the auditorium with a slideshow that cascaded in slick, beguiling shapes. The graphics promised a simplified pipeline, a flattened approval flow, and a system where decisions were made by agile minds, not ancient gates. He used the word root as if it were a badge of courage. I sat in the 3rd row, my hands folded, listening for the technical underpinnings that should have accompanied such claims. There were none. Instead, there were anecdotes about speed and customer testimonials, corporate myth-making dressed as a roadmap. The audience applauded, that early-stage enthusiasm that follows any good marketing story. People want to believe their company can pivot and soar. The problem is certain infrastructures are not pivot-ready. They are a lattice of promises and dependencies. They require respect. They require time. After the town hall, he sought me out. He strode into the subterranean corridors like he had all the maps already memorized. He found my office by habit, as if the maze of HVAC ducts and labeled conduits were a shopping mall directory to him. He wanted to remove friction and empower teams. He wanted access, he wanted exceptions, and he wanted my lanyard. He made it casual when he asked for it. He said, "Just a ceremony, symbolic. You know how these things look. Brand, culture, optics. We cut the ribbon, we cut the lanyard. It's a photo op. The message is that we trust our engineers." He smiled the smile of someone convinced that optics were the same thing as reality. There is a particular kind of arrogance that mistakes ceremony for governance. It is rarely malicious. It is often ignorant. It is always dangerous. I remember looking at him, then at my token. That titanium disc had been through audits with me. It had signed off on agreements, triggered processes, and stood, in essence, for the network of obligations we had built to prevent just such theatricality. It was not a prop. It was a linchpin of trust between our company and the agencies who depended on our rigor. I tried to explain that to him. I did not shout. I do not shout in rooms where consequences must be counted. I listed in plain language what tampering with access would mean: contracted obligations, federal certifications, the chain of custody that underpinned partners' confidence. I described at a conceptual level the notion of a dead man's switch, a defensive architecture that triggers protective measures when critical validation is removed. I was careful. I described the concept with the distance of a watchmaker explaining the role of a governor in an engine, what it does, not how to break it. He laughed softly. "You're being dramatic, Aerys," he said. "We're not blowing things up. We're freeing teams." Jared Frey, who had been installed as acting head of IT, a man who moved with the nervous compliance of someone promoted past their depth, stood at the edge of the room and shifted his weight. Jared had always been malleable. In the 6 months since he'd taken the role, he'd learned the sound of assent and polished it into a habit. Later that week, I had a private meeting with both of them in a glass conference room that reflected the afternoon's light like a second divided sky. Kieran offered me a compromise. He would take a staged, ceremonial cut, then IT would reissue a lanyard tied to new policy. The words reissue and policy were shields. Behind them was an assumption that bureaucracies bounce back instantly and without cost. Jared, whom I had once trained in incident reporting, leaned forward and used language I recognized from Panic, the kind of understatement people deploy when they are already starting to default away from protocol. "We can work around the alerts," he said. "We can suppress the noise. We can patch the system so it looks good." He meant bypass. He meant shortcuts. I put my hand on the titanium token then in the conference room light. You prod history when you mess with anchors. I took a different tack. I did not threaten. I documented. There is an art to documentation. It is not merely typing words into a corporate system to be archived. Documentation is a social contract. It is a ledger that folds into legal argument and audit evidence. I prepared a memo for the board. I wrote it cleanly, line by line, outlining the risks of reducing governed access to a public spectacle. I enumerated statutory points where the company's certifications required unbroken oversight. I copied counsel and the audit office. I printed sealed duplicates and left them with the legal team and the physical archives in the facility's evidence locker. I had Marcus, our long-serving security guard, sign as witness on a receipt for the sealed package, small gestures that create friction for anyone trying to claim later that nothing opposing the ceremony had been raised. I am not sentimental about paperwork, but if you think of a process like a scaffold of truths, the documents are the bolts. They don't stop a man with scissors, but they make it possible for an institution to name the damage and seek remedy. I made the record because a record gives you leverage when leadership is lured by spectacle. The board, as boards often do, preferred optimism. Reports that suggested frictioning innovation did not have the same journalistic allure as photos of new leadership cutting ribbons. Lawrence Ashford, the founder, sat politely in a velvet seat, half listening, likely weighing his son's charisma against the company's quarterly horizon. The board had already decided that the optics were worth a moment on the front page. Kieran moved the narrative toward theater. He declared a symbolic act, the lanyard cutting. He chose the day of a client showcase, because every public gesture requires witnesses. He arranged for a photographer stationed like a priest with a camera. He scheduled it at midday when LinkedIn traffic peaks and press teams can get a glass of water between posting GIFs. There was a stage in the atrium that morning, white and glossy, lights too bright like surgical bulbs. People who'd spent the week in server bays found the fluorescent sheen uncomfortable. I watched the lights settle into the crowd, some faces eager, some neutral, some whose expressions were unreadable. I had told myself I would attend and that I would speak to anyone who asked. I kept my lanyard under my coat until the moment felt necessary. He called me up for the photo. He asked me with that public boy grin that confuses charm with respect. "Come up here, Aerys," he said. "Cut it together. Legacy meets future." The microphone amplified his voice until it sounded like a broadcast. I took the stage. There were cameras angled for the press release, a prompter showing exactly the phrase Kieran wanted to use. He handed me the lanyard, and for a second you could see his vision in the way he clasped it. This was both hands-on theater and a literal reaching for power. On stage, people expected warmth, a ceremonial snip, applause. It would be quick, light, innocuous. He had procured oversized ceremonial scissors, a joke of weight and shine marketed to executives with a sense of drama. He asked for scissors. They gave him the scissors. There is a certain resonance to scissors on a lanyard in a room full of people who believe in headlines. It landed like a punctuation mark at the end of a speech. He smiled. The camera focused on the metal glinking. Someone in the front row took a selfie with the scene as a backlit backdrop. He cut. The sound was neither loud nor theatrical. It was banal, almost domestic. Metal against cloth, a small micro-explosion of fibers. But in that click there was a hinge where something changed. My token, which had been an object of habit between my fingers when I first checked it that morning, fell out of my hand with a soft metallic clatter and hit the stage floor. You learn a lot about a system from its silence. That room, seconds after the cut, became heavy as if someone had pulled a blanket over a speaker. The servers did not scream. The alarms did not make themselves into a spectacle. Instead, systems that had obeyed rules for a decade began to follow them. Processes we had deliberately designed to remove human whim from critical decisions did exactly what they were meant to. They acted as if someone had just removed a key affirmation. The algorithms of governance, our dead man measures, our checks, began a sequence that I had reasoned into the architecture years ago. Protective isolations, revocation of certain automatic privileges, initiation of contingency holds. The room's screens went from green to amber. A server dashboard flashed status changes that only those of us who had watched them for years could read as a slow, relentless kind of refusal. No pyrotechnics sprang forth, that was the point. The response was institutional and lawful, a cascade of rules executing in place of a human. It was the system informing the world that the human chain was broken. Kieran's smile faltered, micro-expressions I had learned to read in audit interviews where executives discover loss. He looked toward Jared with the kind of panic that arrives fast on sanitized faces. Jared, who had promised shortcuts, looked back at me across the stage as if for permission. It was not permission he wanted, it was a route to undo what had been done without the public noticing. I left the stage before the applause, which had dissolved into confusion. My colleagues' faces were fixed, the way faces are when someone has just realized that the rug under their feet has an edge. I walked past the atrium, past the glossy brochures, past the photographer lowering his camera as if to capture a mistake he had not been briefed for. I could have tried to stop it, could have reached down and picked up the token, tried to explain, to reassure, to negotiate under the lights. But there is a form of power in allowing protocols to do their work. If you interfere at the moment a rule must act, you place yourself between the check and the result. You make your judgment the arbiter. I do not do that when the rule is the correct guardrail. Outside, in the corridor, the hum of the building became a different thing, not soothing, but activated. My phone began to ping, messages from counsel, an automated alert from the compliance system, a neutral tone designed not to inflame but to inform, and then from somewhere high in a server room, a low, rising tone that only those of us who had memorized the systems could hear as a change in state. I walked to the stairwell and descended. I did not run. That would have looked like panic. I wanted instead to leave with the dignity of someone who had made an argument and then allowed the institution to adjudicate it. The point was never to make a spectacle of myself. It had been to preserve a truth, that systems defend without my drama. I walked past Marcus at his post. He raised an eyebrow. Long-standing colleagues learned to ask questions later. On the drive home, the city felt like it had been curated into a radio show of normality. Taxi horns, a dog barking, a woman's laugh from the sidewalk. I parked on the hill overlooking the industrial strip and sat for a long time, feeling the titanium disc's absence, not as weight, but as a hollowing of a hinge. I knew what the architecture would do. I had designed it to act when the bureaucratic bone was broken, not as a shortcut to revenge, but as a last resort protection against the very kind gestures that, when wielded by the naive, strip institutions of their obligations. My phone filled with messages faster than I expected. Counsel called in a tone that mixed panic with professional protocol. "Aerys," Miriam Cole said in a voice that had the clipped edge of someone trying to keep a ship from listing, "we're going to need you to come back." Her breath was measured, the kind you hear when a decision must be dressed in law. The board clerk sent a terse note. Jared's assistant texted nothing coherent and then a photo of the stage, showing Kieran mid-smile, his hand still extended. I let the messages come. I sat and listened to the server hum carried on the evening's breeze. This time, the memory played through like a lullaby of things that must be fixed. I repeated to myself the steps I had documented earlier that week, the sealed copies, the memos left with counsel, Marcus's signed receipt. If you want leverage in a room of executives and lawyers, you assemble the ledger. You do not rely on the honesty of the person who can photo-op their way back into power. You should understand my posture here. This was not celebration. Revenge is a word people don't use when the aim is institutional fidelity. There is a moral weight to designing systems that refuse to be quelled by charm. If a ceremonial cut can undermine contracts that secure life-saving research or national infrastructure, then a ceremonial cut must be met with the gravity of institutional response. My revenge, if it can be called that, was the enforcement of the rules I had helped build. It was the thing I would have wanted if the positions were reversed, that the system, not a human ego, declare the consequence. Someone will always ask whether I intended the fallout. The answer is simple. I intended no chaos. I intended an outcome in which due process, not personality, stood between an impulsive act and collective harm. The design was defensive, not punitive. If that distinction feels fine in the light, it feels surgical in practice. It preserves possibility. It forecloses uncalculated damage. The building lights blinked in time with alerts as I drove down the hill. I could hear the distant murmur of reporters in a way that felt like distant thunder. My phone buzzed again, an encrypted message from a vendor contact who wrote a single line, "We're seeing D-cert." I let it sit, unread. I had made the record because I had to. Now the record would do its work. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car until night shaded the edges of the house. The titanium disc felt like a memory under the skin. The world beyond my windows kept moving, a neighbor's television glow, the small red light of a smoke alarm on a distant rooftop, the unremarkable life of a city that does not know about the hinge it is walking past. I brewed tea in a kettle that sang in an old way. Familiarity is its own armor. By midnight, the first external call came from Miriam. The tone had shifted from legal caution to far-off urgency.
"Aerys," she said, "federal contacts are asking for an incident briefing in the morning. The board has requested you return as a consultant." There was a pause. "We can't do this without you." I listened. Being indispensable is not a thing I value for ego. It is a resource you manage. I had made sure the memo was plain. Help would not be free. Public statements would be required. Indemnities would be negotiated, and no single player would be allowed to rewrite the narrative with press releases. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Come in tomorrow," she said. "Bring your notes. We'll work it through." I hung up and placed the telephone on the kitchen counter as if it were a physical object I could set aside, a layer between my present and the room I had built. I thought then of the engineers who would come to work the next day, their faces when they opened terminals to find systems rejecting a status quo that had been quietly assumed for years. I thought of young tech leads who had been told to move fast, who would find their tickets closed by processes that had nothing to do with speed, but everything to do with responsibility. I thought of Kieran, who had grasped for the ease of a press release and instead found himself inside a process that was indifferent to charm. I slept a little that night. I dreamed of clocks, gears that turned slowly and with stubborn purpose, a reminder that institutions march at a pace set by consequence, not by headlines. When morning came, sunlight cut a stripe across the kitchen table. My phone lit up in ways that blurred the gradient of panic to business. There were requests for interviews, none of which I agreed to. There were emails from 2 federal program officers asking for high-level incident reports and offering that they would stand by for any required coordination. There was a message from Marcus. They sent units to the gate. Engineers camped in the atrium. Short human notes that asked for no judgment. I dressed in a plain coat, put my keys in the pocket, and took the stairs down into the world I had seeded to process. My car sounded ordinary as I drove back toward the campus. My hands were steady on the wheel. There is a quiet that exists in those first decisive steps back into a place where the rules you wrote are already doing their work. You feel both the loneliness of authority and the confidence that comes from being proportionally accountable. I parked near the service entrance, where the security team now operated under orders they could not fully articulate beyond observe and report. Marcus gave me a look like a man who had watched his town be altered while he slept. "We did what we could keep under seal," he said, a simple sentence carrying months of fidelity. I nodded. Chain of custody is a phrase that tastes like metal when you breathe it aloud. It is an anchor. In the lobby, groups clustered as if not yet certain whether to fold into urgency or to aim for normalcy. The atrium, which the previous day had been a stage for spectacle, now felt like a stage set for accountability. Kieran sat in a glass office, a chair purchased to convey command. He looked older than his title. His jaw had set into something steadier, less practiced. Lawrence Ashford was there too, set like an artifact of a prior generation's confidence, watching, perhaps beginning to understand the scale of what had been triggered.
My presence on that campus that morning was not a return to employment. I was a consultant in name and practice, a necessary instrument invoked to translate institutional consequences back into operational remediation. My terms were plain and professional: retainer, indemnity, and a public statement that would include, among other things, an admission that executive interference had materially contributed to the incident. I had learned over the years that truth has a cost for institutions that trade in reputation. If your public face requires sanctity, then the admission of error will demand indemnities and carefully worded releases. I was prepared to bargain for the integrity of the record. They asked why I had not shouted on stage, why I had not engaged head-on when the scissors came. I told them the same thing I tell auditors and curious journalists. When you are the guardian of a system meant to protect, you do not dignify spectacle with your person. You document, you witness, and you let the architecture of consequence do what it is designed to do. I could feel in some of the faces in the room the slow dawning of comprehension that perhaps the very thing they had mocked as bureaucracy was the only thing preventing catastrophe. But understanding is not repair. The institution would have to reconcile public perception with legal obligations and client contracts. That reconciliation requires time and labor, and most painfully, human faces. Engineers who worried about livelihoods, program managers whose schedules unraveled, families affected by severances none of them had planned for. I had thought about those costs the night before, and they sat with me now like stones in my chest. They offered me a short-term engagement: come in, lead the response, coordinate with federal partners, and help shepherd a path to recertification. They wanted me back as if the solution to a broken trust could be secured by the presence of the person who had built the trust to begin with. It was flattering in the way being asked to hold the roof over a burning house can be flattering. It was also a purely pragmatic choice on their part. I knew it. I reviewed the documents I had prepared the week prior, now standing in a room that smelled of brewed coffee and the soft paper of urgent folders. I corrected a line here, a nuance there. I made sure the language could not be folded into a press release that would misattribute the origin of the incident. Clarity is a means of justice for institutions. It prevents obfuscation and protects the people who had trusted in process. The morning stretched, and the first external media requests began to arrive. Headlines appeared as brittle things with an appetite for sensational verbs. CEO's son cuts badge, company halts operations, one read. The spin on social platforms moved faster than the thing it described, as is its nature. I watched, removed and clinical, as narratives formed that would later require unpicking by lawyers and auditors. I had designed the architecture to do one thing: resist human improvisation that endangered assets and agreements. It did. The rest would be the long arithmetic of recovery: audits, legal wrangling, a descent into the physical logistics of data retrieval, conversations with federal liaisons, and the human cost of a workforce suddenly unsure of paychecks. Those were not things to resolve in a single morning's meeting. There are people who will read this and call what I did calculated revenge. Perhaps. If silence and adherence to principle can be called revenge, then so be it. I have never enjoyed spectacle. I have always preferred to be the person who designs a system that ensures the right outcome when people fail. The difference between contempt and correction is the difference between spectacle and structure. By noon, the atrium was open to a small group of council and board members. Kieran sat at the edge of the circle like a man who had finally been tasked with listening to the consequences of his own choices. He wanted the quick fix: a statement, a PR strategy, a narrative that would return him to the glossy photos he sought. The board wanted the same. They were not yet reconciled to the idea that some narratives cannot be edited into comfort. Miriam asked me what I would need to proceed. My answer was procedural. I wanted autonomy in the first 72 hours. I wanted sealed evidence preserved. I wanted the power to negotiate with federal liaisons without interference. I wanted public clarity. Those are not unreasonable things when contracts and certifications hang in the balance. Kieran cleared his throat and tried to say something conciliatory. I didn't mean, he began. You meant what you did, I said calmly. Intent doesn't erase impact. Policy protects. The room swallowed a silence that felt like a held breath. He looked at me then, perhaps realizing that optics cannot substitute for operational responsibility. His father put a hand on his shoulder in a gesture that might have been comfort or restraint. The image, founder seeking to steady a son who stepped into the machinery of consequence, felt old as institutions themselves. We agreed then, with all the care of people who know how fragile their accords are, I would lead the immediate response as an independent consultant. There would be a retainer, indemnities, and an agreed-upon public statement acknowledging that the company's leadership had materially contributed to the incident. That last clause was non-negotiable for me. Truth, when admitted, prevents narratives that rewrite responsibility. If a system is to be repaired, the record must align with fact. They signed documents with hands that trembled just enough to show how much was at stake. Lawrence signed with an old executive flourish. Kieran's signature was a scrawl tight with the sudden knowledge of bureaucratic consequence. When the meeting adjourned, the engineers reassembled in smaller groups. Some spoke in low, practical terms about data integrity. Others spoke with the rawness of worry. A junior lead approached me and asked what this meant for her team. I told her what I could, that the protective measures were in place to prevent unauthorized access and that we would be transparent about timelines as allowed by the contracts. She nodded as if that could buffer her apartment rent, her phone bill, the small daily anxieties that make a life. Then the first of the external calls came through from a federal liaison. Dr. Thorne, the voice said, we need to coordinate on an initial integrity assessment. We spoke at a high level, no technical steps, just the reality that agencies would be informed and would require their own review. I confirmed availability and we scheduled calls. Institutions must talk to institutions. I have no appetite for theatrics with partners whose work touches national interests. As the day wound down, there was a brief moment alone in the server corridor where the air hummed the way it always had. The racks stood like pews, the cables like hymns. I walked the length, feeling the hum under my shoes and the mild ozone at the edges where machines thought and cooled. I lay a hand on a cabinet as if to read a pulse. Systems, I thought then, are moral agents in the way rules are. They enact the values we build into them. I had helped build a defense that refused to be gamed. That defense had done its work. Then I did something most people who read headlines will find hard to believe. I went home and made tea. I sat with the ordinary because our lives are made of the ordinary and the extraordinary, and one exists beside the other. The extraordinary, press conferences, sudden audits, the whispered meetings in conference rooms will take the stage. The ordinary will ask for rent. That night, Kieran's name trended on social platforms. Comment threads filled with condemnation and praise in equal measure. Some called my actions cold, some called them principled. I read only a little. I do not let noise guide my decisions. I let record and law do that work. I keep thinking of the titanium token, of the small decisive click of the scissors that had sounded trivial and then monumental. It is a strange thing to be at the center of a narrative where a small object becomes the hinge for a great unspooling. Objects matter. They carry history. We must, as a society, learn to let structures we design do the hard work of protection, especially when human beings in suits prefer the image of being in control to the discipline of actually being so. In the morning, there would be auditors, there would be lawyers, and the first of the physical logistics, a trip to a cold storage facility in Utah where backup tapes slept in boxes and custodians tallied access requests. Reconstruction would require muscle as much as it would require policy. crates to be moved, auditors to be fed, nights in logistics warehouses, and conversations that would test the moral metabolism of a company that had once prided itself on longevity. But those were tomorrow's scenes. For now, there was a kettle on the stove, and a small, elegant understanding. Silence is often the form competence takes. People who shout to prove themselves to a room rarely know how to listen when systems speak. I poured another cup of tea and let the steam fog the window for a moment. Outside, the city lights shimmered. In their glow, I saw the faint echo of the atrium's stage lights and felt, in the center of my chest, a steady sort of calm. The system had responded. The ledger had been set in motion. The rest would be work. Substantial, inconvenient work. At a little after midnight, I opened my laptop and began to draft a briefing to the federal contact scheduled to call in the morning. I wrote in clear, spare sentences, the way you measure a bridge's load. Facts, timestamps, witnesses. The tone was factual because facts are the only thing that keep institutions honest when their reflex is to bury inconvenience. I saved the file and closed the laptop. The house hummed with ordinary appliances and the small, comforting noises of life not yet rearranged by headlines. I slept in short, repairable segments, my mind mapping the logistics I would face when daylight arrived. There is a steadiness that comes from doing the job properly, even when the work costs people dearly. I woke at dawn with a message pinned to the top of my inbox. Boards are calling. Council asks for availability at 0800. I brewed more tea, put the kettle on the stove, and prepared to return to a place where consequence would be negotiated in the language of lawyers and engineers. I felt the weight of that negotiation like a physical thing in the pockets of my coat. It was not bitterness I felt. It was the calmness of someone who has always believed that systems, if designed and respected, hold the record of truth. When I left the house, I took my keys and an old photograph tucked into my wallet. A younger me in a lab coat, holding a soldering iron, smiling at a project that had not yet become a company. I folded my hand over the picture like one might fold over a small, fragile map. I am, first and last, a builder. My work is to make structures that outlast the whims that occasionally threaten them. As I drove back to the campus, the city awoke around me. Headlines bleeding through radios, notification tones, the soft clatter of traffic lights. It all felt like the background noise to a procedure I had already set in motion. I was returning not as a conqueror or a casualty, but as someone who had articulated a principle and put it into practice. The rest would be consequence. The rest would be work. The rest would be negotiation and, inevitably, fallout. At the service gate, Marcus nodded. He handed me a printed notice that had been pinned to the security board a few minutes before. Facility operations temporarily limited pending security review. It was bureaucratic in tone and precise in effect, a piece of paper carrying a weight that would reverberate beyond our walls. I signed in as a consultant and walked the corridor toward the conference room where the first of the post-incident meetings would convene. People were there already. Miriam with her legal binder, board members with faces grown taut from the strain, engineers looking like men and women who had been told to hold the line. Kieran waited at the end of the table, his hands folded like someone waiting to be judged by the machinery of the company he had helped to unsettle. He looked up as I entered. His face now carried a new, thinner expression, an honest look that had not been there the day before. I sat and placed my tea on the table. "This is not a press stunt any longer," I said. "This is a sequence of contractual and operational consequences that we must respect. If we want to rebuild trust, we build it in public, with clear ownership." He opened his mouth to deflect, to reach for the comforting narratives that had always served him. The room stilled. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck's brakes hissed. The servers in the room acknowledged status changes with a steady, impartial flicker. We would spend the day haggling over terms, the way city councils haggle over bridges. We would talk about indemnities, about retentions, about how to phrase a public statement that would not read as evasion. We would divide labor, call lines, and set schedules. We would decide who would travel to the cold storage vault and who would brief the agency liaisons. And yet, beneath those practicalities, there was an old, stubborn rhythm. Systems do not bend to vanity. They reveal the truth of a situation in measures and logs and legalities. The public will read an image, scissors, a smiling executive. The private realm will read a ledger. One is noise, the other is a record. When noon came, the first of the auditors arrived. They carried clipboards and an expression that had nothing to do with spectacle. They had flown from other cities, slept in hotels, and readied themselves to do the long, precise work of assessing integrity.
Integrity, I told myself as I walked them through the evidence locker and the signed receipts, is a muscle. It must be exercised, nourished, and, in times like these, defended. The afternoon unfolded in fragments of intense practicality, calls to agency liaisons, a negotiation with legal about the wording of a client notice, packing lists for a trip to Utah to retrieve archived backups, and an initial casualty list of contracts that would be delayed or paused. There was a heavy undercurrent of grief in some conversations, loss of contract revenue, layoffs that would ripple out, confidence that would be recalibrated in boardrooms for quarters to come. I listened to all of it. I wrote notes. I checked the chain of custody logs again, and I walked the server floor, feeling the machine's faint vibrations as one might feel the pulse in a temple. The system had done its duty. Now we had to manage the human and legal consequences of a system acting like an institution rather than like a person pressed into a photo. As the sun began to edge toward evening, a junior engineer found me in the corridor. "Will this all come back?" she asked, voice small with the kind of worry that lives in the margins of paychecks and family dinners. "I don't know," I started. Then I stopped. No one can promise that a company will be the same after a shock like this. That is not the nature of systems. "I don't know if—" I stopped myself. I realized in that moment how easily the word always sits in the mouths of people who have never been audited. No one can promise continuity when contracts and certificates hinge on compliance. "I don't know if everything comes back the way it was," I told her, "but I can tell you what we will do to try." Her shoulders fell in a way that made the conversation suddenly small and human. "Then do it," she said. "Take us through it." I did, not with technical manuals or theatrical slogans, but with the only thing that steadies a team, a plan measured in tasks that could be verified. We would prioritize client obligations, map affected programs, validate which archives were intact, and begin the logistics of retrieval. It was not a promise of restoration, it was an agreement to try, to make the ledger show the effort. The weeks that followed were a study in institutional decline and stubborn repair. Contracts that had once been revenue streams turned into paperwork. Clients paused work pending audit clearances. Partners who had never had to measure their trust in public asked for immediate assurances. Headcount projections were revisited with a kind of clinical cruelty. HR created packages to reduce exposure. I signed off on an emergency operating budget that favored continuity work over new initiatives. We talked about triage like surgeons in a long operation. Kieran was moved to a role with a fancier title and fewer keys. The board conferred and resolved, gently at first, then with the bluntness of people defending their legacies, he would no longer have direct operational authority. He was reassigned to lead a small innovation outreach group, an optics-friendly position that kept him public-facing and away from any access that could again trigger the protections we had just relied upon. The move was a mercy and a containment. It left him with a press release and a deeply diminished set of responsibilities. Pride does not recover its original shape easily. Lawrence Ashford had to reconcile a father's instinct with the company's survival. He issued a statement, measured, contrite, and crafted by counsel, that acknowledged the executive error without excoriating his son publicly. It was, in every sense, an attempt to preserve the founding myth, even while filing an addendum to reality. That balancing act would cost the company trust with some partners and buy it breathing room with others. There were quiet things that no press release would capture. The junior engineer who had asked me if things would come back lost her job 3 weeks after the incident when a key contract she had been staffing was paused indefinitely. She left with a box of personal items and a timid thank you. There was a man in facilities who had worked at Vanguard 17 years, who we offered early retirement to because the new budget simply couldn't justify his position. There were families recalibrating monthly budgets. My revenge, I thought sometimes in the dead hours, was not antiseptic. It landed on real human bodies. The Utah expedition was the moment the story exited the abstract and became labor. The tapes, literal physical boxes stacked in cold vaults, were not cinematic artifacts. They were paper, plastic, and catalog numbers. We flew on a small charter that smelled of coffee and the faint tang of industrial cleaners. The plane landed near a town that seemed to exist for the storage facilities alone, low-slung buildings, service trucks, and the kind of stillness that only desert places can hold. The facility itself was an exercise in bureaucratic efficiency. Card readers at a lobby, an auditor's desk with a neat stack of chain of custody forms, and a custodian with an expression that said she had seen every color of panic. There is a rough nobility to cataloging what remains. We signed forms, our signatures officiating access. Each box was opened in a room that felt both cool and claustrophobic, the scent of ozone again, the whisper of cartons stacked like a library of second chances. We did not find immediate salvation. We found fragments, whole swaths of data in formats that demanded patience to translate, and a series of records proving that prior maintenance and audits had been performed. The tapes were not a miracle, they were evidence and hard work. They would have to be read, reconciled, and reconstituted into usable datasets. That takes time, people, and daylight. We loaded crates into trucks beneath a sky that was clean in a way our lives rarely are. The physical labor was therapeutic in a way I did not expect. Engineers who had been reduced in public perception to kids in hoodies now hoisted boxes and taped seals with a care I recognized as professional reverence. One of them, a man named Fareed, who had a surgical precision at the console, told me as we strapped down pallets that he used to think the work was about code. "It's about responsibility," he said, wiping dust from his palms. "Paperwork just makes that responsibility legible." Back at Vanguard, the slow arithmetic of recovery began. Servers were rebuilt in racks that smelled of new plastic and metal. Cable trays were refilled with tidy loops. Auditors walked the floor with clipboards and questions that read like a catechism. We ran validations that were, by design, excruciatingly slow. Manual reconciliations, comparisons of checksums by vendors, and cross-references to logs whose integrity we could vouch for only because we had preserved the original records. Each successful verification was a small triumph. Each discrepancy required an escalating level of legal and technical attention. The media coverage was a separate, grinding world. Headlines favored the image of the cut. They did not always help readers understand the months of work that followed. Social threads simplified the event into a morality play: villain, hero, spectacle, consequence. It's the way modern narratives prefer sharp edges.
The reality was a long grind. I spent hours with Miriam negotiating phrasing for statements that would not compromise ongoing legal processes. She had learned to be both pragmatic and ethically fierce. The two traits are not mutually exclusive. Counsel demanded temperate statements. Federal partners asked for factual briefings and offered to observe without casting judgment. My role in those rooms was to keep the ledger honest. Financially, the company shrank. Revenue projections were reworked downward. Some clients never returned, citing risk aversion. Others stayed, but their contracts were renegotiated with more oversight than before. The board authorized cost reductions and agreed to re-accredit programs only under strict external review. There were layoffs that took months to administer, always done in the language of necessity rather than choice. I attended exit interviews occasionally because someone needed to listen to the anger, the confusion, and the quiet gratitude. The human cost was real. The company's legacy, 15 years of steady reliability, had been compressed into a narrative that now included a public failure. Kieran's professional trajectory became a study in containment. The board's decision to move him away from operational power was not demotion so much as isolation. He was given projects that allowed him to speak at conferences and appear in interviews, safe places where his charisma could be monetized without endangering systems. He posted about learning lessons on social feeds and did the right combination of contrition and optimism. People were generous with second chances as long as those second chances cost them little. The company survived, but it was undeniably diminished. The 15-year arc we had built had been shortened. The company's pride was now tempered by a new humility. During negotiations, I held firm to the principles I had laid out when I agreed to consult. I demanded indemnity, that the company accept responsibility publicly for the chain of events that led to the incident. I insisted that any press communications make clear that executive interference had contributed materially to the operational failure. That was not pettiness. It was a way to ensure the record matched the truth. If a company attempts to sanitize its history, it creates future risk. Narratives cobbled to spare blushes later become lies that require more lies. Miriam and I negotiated the public language until it read like a legal sonnet, precise, unflowery, accountable. The statement acknowledged the event, admitted leadership error, and pledges to remediate. It included a commitment to full cooperation with federal partners. Once approved, it was delivered as a joint release that was less theatrical than it was honest. The markets did not love it. Some clients did. Honesty has a cost and an eventual currency. One of the most trying parts of the recovery was watching otherwise competent people reckon with consequences for things they had been told were virtues: speed, deference to executive direction, and the glamorization of innovation. Many engineers told me that before Kieran, they had been rewarded for diligence. Afterwards, they realized that moving fast had, in their environment, meant unmooring their work from the protections that kept contracts intact. We began to build training around risk literacy and executive-sensitive protocols. Those sessions were not glamorous, but they were necessary. We taught people to see processes not as obstacles, but as resilience. Months passed. Recertification was a long, bureaucratic climb. We submitted evidence, received auditors, addressed findings, and reworked policies. The work was tedious and meticulous, a series of reforms that made the company more resilient but also smaller in its ambitions. Some of our biggest contracts never returned to prior scale. The company, which once measured itself by reach, now had to measure itself by reliability in narrower corridors. The 15-year legacy did not vanish, it simply shed parts that could not be reconciled with the new reality. There were legal settlements with a handful of clients who had suffered the most. Those settlements were confidential and expensive. The board approved them because they were cheaper than reputational erosion. The company's valuation dropped. Investors were patient in some quarters and merciless in others. The story of the cut was, not surprisingly, used by competitors as a cautionary tale. We lost market share in some segments and hardened in others. Sometimes you win a small moral victory and trade it for practical shrinkage. The human stories were the hardest ledger to keep. I remember the man in procurement who apologetically explained that his child's summer camp had to be canceled when a vendor payment was delayed. I remember HR's spreadsheet of severance costs and counseling hours carved out for departing staff. The costs were neither abstract nor negligible. They were payments drawn from lives. Through all this, I maintained my consulting agreement, high retainer, indemnity, and conditions that ensured I could communicate directly with federal liaisons. The price was fair. I did not accept it as a vanity. I accepted it because expertise that bridges industry and national interest is valuable and, frankly, demanded. In return, I gave them the work of rebuilding the operational confidence that had made the company valuable in the first place. Some people called my terms steep. Others said they were reasonable. The truth is, when you are the steward of something that others depend on, your labor has a market value that is not purely monetary. It is ethical. I did not want full employment at Vanguard again. I had spent a decade building a system there. To return as an employee would have meant stepping back into the political thicket. Instead, I chose the consultant's boundary. I could enforce the record, help rebuild, and remain professionally untethered. One evening, as we labored under the fluorescent clarity of the server room, an email arrived that pulled me from the tedium. It was a recruitment message from a government liaison I had worked with in prior audits, an invitation to consider a role advising on secure infrastructure across federal programs. The message was oblique and respectful. We have noted your proficiency and would like to discuss an advisory role. I set the email aside like a pebble that might be chosen later. The nonchalance of my action was deliberate. I did not choose fate by answering on impulse. Weeks later, after audits and policies and settlements had settled into a rhythm, I received the call. The voice on the other end was direct. Would you consider a formal advisory position? They outlined scope at a high level, oversight, standards, and strategy across programs that demanded neutral, experienced guidance. I listened. The proposition required me to leave the private sector in a way I had not planned. It promised influence, but at the cost of a public life that liked to be private. I did not accept immediately. I negotiated, in my own fashion, with myself. There was something about the invitation that felt like restoration, an opportunity to make systems less fragile in a broader context. I thought of the young engineer in the atrium and of the man in procurement whose child had lost a summer camp. I thought of an industry that too often mistakes charisma for competence. In the end, I accepted a limited engagement, not a full-time role, but a series of advisory stints that would let me influence standards without becoming an arm of bureaucracy. It felt proportionate, enough leverage to change policy where it mattered, and enough distance to remain personally accountable to the craft of building. The offer came with clearance processes and non-disclosure agreements, as is proper for that kind of work. I understood that my life would change. I understood, too, that the arc of my career had been altered not by an act of vanity, but by the decision to let an institutional guardrail do what it had been designed to do. Kieran's career arc was less generous. He made a few speaking circuits, wrote about the balance between speed and safety, and slowly became a cautionary figure in industry panels. He apologized in interviews and walked the line between contrition and branding. People forgave him, as people do, if the forgiveness costs the forgiver little. The company survived as a leaner, humbler entity. It kept clients who valued reliability over flash. It lost clients who preferred style. Its market presence became quieter, its work became more focused. The legacy of 15 years did not crumble into dust, it shifted. It retained a core of competence but lost some of its breadth. My own life resumed with a different rhythm. I spent mornings drafting policy and afternoons in warehouses. I advised federal programs one week and ran tabletop exercises with private sector partners the next. The work was intense in a way that felt right, practical, consequential, and grounded in the kind of ethics that turn design into defense. People asked whether I felt vindicated. The question always felt like bait. Vindication is a small pleasure. I felt instead a professional clarity. The bureaucracy I had once been accused of worshipping had been vindicated by consequence. The system had done what it was supposed to do. That was not vengeance, it was justice in a very specific sense, the enforcement of rules whose purpose is to protect. There were nights I thought of the titanium disc again, its small weight, its silence in a drawer, the way it had fallen from my hand with that tiny clatter. Objects collect meaning. That disc had been a hinge for a process that many people did not understand until it had acted. It had been, in the way that small tokens often are, a boundary between what people thought they could do and what they were obligated to preserve. In quiet moments now, when a server hums or when an auditor thanks me for insisting on a line of transparency, I feel an odd gratitude.
There is a satisfaction in being part of a system that resists spectacle. Not because spectacle is always bad, there are moments for celebration, but because spectacle without infrastructure is a risk to other people. The work I do now is to make the infrastructure legible to executives who might otherwise mistake charm for competence. Sometimes I imagine a classroom somewhere where a young executive clutching their first C-suite title is taught to respect process, not as an enemy of speed, but as a grammar for responsibility. I imagine engineers who are rewarded for clear documentation and for the courage to say no when no is the right answer. These are small imaginings. They are the work I try to sustain in the programs I advise. I did not become a public figure in the way some narratives demand. My interviews were limited. My byline appeared in a few long-form pieces that try to explain the arc between spectacle and consequence. People who had once dismissed process as inertia began, slowly, to read the memos and the audit trails, and to ask better questions about governance. That was a more durable shift than any headline. One afternoon, a year after the cut, I walked the atrium at Vanguard. The lights were gentler than before. The abstract art still hung, but now there were small plaques in meeting rooms noting who had led major recertifications. Names mattered less than the principle they marked. I paused by a window and watched people move across the plaza. Engineers, interns, a small group of new hires who carried lunchboxes, and the bright concentration of people who believe their work matters. The company had not returned to what it was before the cut, nor had I wanted it to. It had become a different thing, smaller, steadier, and perhaps more honest about its limits. Kieran passed me in the corridor that day. He nodded. His face had the trace of humility that experience often exacts. He did not seek to reclaim any part of my attention and did not ask for absolution. It was a small, human exchange that required no cameras. On my way out of the building, Marcus, the security guard who had watched the sealed package be stored, insisted I accept a cup of coffee from the little kiosk downstairs. He handed it to me like a benediction. "You did right," he said simply. It was not praise I sought, but the sentence settled into me as if it were a place in which to rest. People who live in institutions know how to measure what has been done. Their judgments are the slow ones that matter. I took the coffee and walked to my car. The air had the light coldness of coming winter. There was a calm that no headline could manufacture. The steady, deliberate sense of someone who had done work that was hard and now lived with the consequence of that work. I had been tempted at times toward theatrics. I had never wanted that.
My satisfaction was not in spectacle, but in the knowledge that systems can be designed to protect the many from the mistakes of the few. If there is a lesson, it is this: competence is often quiet, and quiet is not the same as inactivity. Silence can be the form that discipline takes. When you are underestimated because you do not shout, remember that the most important instruments of safety are often the ones that do not clamor for attention. They are the anchors. If you've ever been dismissed for the discipline you practice, if you've ever felt your care described as obstruction, if you've carried the small weight of responsibility and been asked to trade it for a photo, this story is for you. The system I built did not make me famous, it made me useful. That usefulness protected lives, contracts, and ultimately the livelihoods of people who trusted us to be steady. Before I go, one small ask. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who values the quiet work of keeping things safe. Tell the story of the titanium disc to a colleague. And if you want more narratives like this, stories about systems, consequence, and the work that keeps society from unraveling, consider subscribing. We do better when we learn to value the invisible hands that hold things together. Thank you for listening.